Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Franca Tamaris, the Event Coordinator at the Melbourne Energy Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today we are gathered on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and we acknowledge and pay respects to their elders past and present. Thank you for joining us today for the Australian Energy Market Operators Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report for Quarter 2 2024. Some housekeeping rules before we start. All questions must be submitted through the Q&A option on the menu as the chat function is disabled. We will have some time for questions during the session and at the end as well, and we'll endeavour to get through as many questions as possible. Now to introduce our speaker for today, please welcome Kerry Galloway, Manager Market Insights at AEMO. She leads a team responsible for the Quarterly Energy Dynamics Report, a key publication from AEMO. With 20 years of experience in the energy industry, Kerry has worked in various areas of the wholesale and retail gas and electricity markets, including demand forecasting, network planning and connections, and market reform delivery. She holds a Bachelor of Engineering, Mechanical Engineering and Bachelor of Science, Applied Mathematics from Monash University. Today's moderator is Professor Nando Okya, Professor of Smart Grids and Power Systems in Electrical and Electronic Engineering at the University of Melbourne. Nando holds a bachelor's degree in Mechanical and Electrical Engineering from UNI, Peru, and a research Master's Science and PhD in Electrical Power Engineering, both from UNESP, Solteira, Brazil. Nando is Professor of Smart Grids and Power Systems in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering. He is an IEEE PES Director, Distinguished Lecturer rather, an IEEE Senior Member and past editorial board member of the IEEE Power and Energy magazine. Thank you for joining us, and now over to you, Kerry.
Thank you. So thank you for having me here today to discuss the QED for Quarter 2 2024. So our QED provides a detailed overview of all the quarterly outcomes of all the markets that AEMO operates, which is shown here on this slide. But I will just note that I will not be covering the Western Australian outcomes today, and you will need to refer to the QED report for those details. So I'll be starting by walking us through the NEM outcomes, so focusing on demand and price trends, interconnector flows and FCAS. We'll break for Q&A after FCAS, and then we'll come back to talk about NEM generation, and then finishing up with the East Coast gas outcomes. So starting today's presentation with the NEM demand outcomes. And when we examine demand, particularly on a quarterly basis, weather is a significant driver. And this quarter had some mixed weather patterns. So Queensland experienced warmer conditions in April, while Victoria had colder weather in both April and June. So the chart on the top right shows the year-on-year change in heating degree days for each month over the quarter for each region. And that gives us an indication of the sort of coldness of the weather across those regions. So these weather variations are directly. So Queensland with the warmer April and Victoria with the colder April and June both experienced increases in underlying and operational demand. In contrast, the weather changes across the months in the other regions sort of largely balanced each other out. So they only had minor changes in underlying demand and then reductions in operational demand. So the demand increases in Queensland and Victoria caused an overall rise in NEM underlying demand, which was up 359 megawatts or 1.5%, reaching a new Quarter 2 record high of 23964 megawatts. This was partially offset by growth in rooftop PV or distributed PV, which also reached a new Quarter 2 high of 2050 megawatts. So these two factors combined to produce a 0.9% increase in operational demand to reach 21913 megawatts. And as shown in this figure on the bottom, this increase in operational demand was observed across almost all hours of the day, with the only exception being in the midday period where solar rooftop PV was at its kind of peak. Okay, so moving to price outcomes. Chart on the here shows quarterly average prices, and they were $133 per megawatt hour across the NEM for Q2 2024, which was a 23% year-on-year increase. So we'll be looking at the price drivers in more details as we go, but in general, low wind availability and reduced hydro generation led to a greater reliance on higher price generation. And we also had some transmission and generation outages, which led to some periods of price volatility. So when we break down the prices regionally, as shown here on the bottom right, prices in all regions except for Queensland increased. And in Victoria, SA and Tasmania, the price increase mainly occurred in what we call the energy component, which is the solid portion of the bar here. And this represents the contributions of spot prices under $300 per megawatt hour to the overall average. So it effectively excludes the impact of volatility. However, in contrast, the price increase in New South Wales was driven by the cap return component, so that's that stripy bit of the bars, and that includes the impact of the spot prices in excess of $300 per megawatt hour, so captures the volatility impacts. And if we look at this chart, we can see that New South Wales accounted for the majority of the total cap return across the NEM this quarter. It had 79%, and in fact 90% of this 79% occurred on just 2 days, which were the 7th and 8th of May. And we'll be discussing those 2 days further as we go. In terms of negative prices, these did drop this quarter. So the percentage of intervals with negative prices this quarter was down from 9% last year to 7% this quarter. Queensland was the only region to have an increase in negative prices, and it had the highest number of negative prices as well this quarter. It increased, was at 14% of intervals, up 5 percentage points from last year. And this was really driven by the sort of high solar generation in the middle of the day, some increased black coal generation, and the Queensland to New South Wales interconnector limiting transfers from Queensland down to New South Wales. Have a look at the price setting dynamics for the quarter. Really just highlighting the factors that led to these higher prices. So starting with wind on the far left here, having low wind availability meant that generators set the price less frequently this quarter at only 2% of intervals, down from 4% in Q2 2023. And the average price when wind was marginal was a negative $32 per megawatt hour, slightly up from the negative $38 per megawatt hour. So this had an overall upward effect on prices. So next, looking at the hydro generation in the blue, due to low rainfall conditions, hydro set the price at higher average levels when it was marginal, so at an average $154 per megawatt hour, up from the $118 per megawatt hour last year. So with the reduction in price setting frequency from the wind and the hydro, gas took on a greater role, setting the price in 15% of intervals, up 2% from last year. Now, why gas did set the price at a slightly lower level when it was marginal at $184 per megawatt hour, down from $190 per megawatt hour, the increased frequency of gas price setting overall contributed to upward pressure on the overall prices. Now, black coal set the price in 25% of intervals, which was pretty similar to last year. On average, it did set prices higher at 110 megawatt hours compared to 97. However, this increase all occurred on just 2 days, which were the 7th and 8th of May. And if we exclude those 2 days from this analysis, black coal would have actually set prices slightly lower than they did last year. And we can also see that battery generation has increased the frequency that it set prices, rising to 5% this quarter from 2% last year, and that's really driven by increased battery capacity. Another factor impacting price volatility and price separation were some transmission outages and generator outages. So for a large part of the quarter, there was a transmission outage between Collector Wind Farm and Yes, which affected northward flows on the Victorian to New South Wales interconnector, and also limited a reasonable amount of gas and hydro and wind generation in southern New South Wales so that it couldn't reach the load centre in Sydney. There was also a shorter outage between Armidale and Tamworth, which impacted the flows on the Queensland to New South Wales interconnector. So these two transmission outages actually coincided with each other, and also with a number of coal generator baseload outages. And these all coincided on the 7th and 8th of May, which led to some extended periods of price volatility in New South Wales, which ultimately resulted in the application of administered price caps, which is the second time that's occurred in the NEM. And the price caps were in place from the 8th to the 14th of May, just in New South Wales. Okay. I'm going to have a closer look at price separation this quarter because it had quite a different dynamic than what we have seen in recent quarters. So typically we see lower prices in the southern regions of Victoria and South Australia because both these regions have quite a high penetration of renewable generation, and then higher prices in the northern regions of New South Wales and Queensland, with the separation between these two areas often due to limitations on northward flow on VNI, particularly during the solar generation hours. However, this quarter had quite different dynamics with the lower wind availability and higher price hydro generation in the southern regions, leading to increases in gas generation and subsequently higher prices in this region. And we show this on the time of day price chart here on the top right. In Queensland, in the red here, recorded the lowest prices, particularly during the middle of the day when solar generation is high. And these low prices in Queensland were actually helped by increased black coal availability. So we had Callide C Unit 3 returning to service after an extended outages, and we had some less outages compared to the same quarter the year before at some other units. So this resulted in a greater volume of black coal being offered, including at lower prices. And we can see this on the bid supply curve here for Queensland black coal generators. So the supply curve has moved across to the left, and we had around $600 more, 600 megawatts more capacity offered at prices less than $300 per megawatt hour. So with an increased solar generation and the additional black coal availability, we had Q&I binding during the solar peak, so that capacity wasn't being able to be transferred through to New South Wales, which caused price separation. And then the other sort of factor to price separation on the quarter was during those price volatility periods, which I discussed on the 7th and 8th of May. Having those two transmission outages meant that we couldn't flow from Victoria to New South Wales and then from Queensland down to New South Wales, really concentrated those price spikes in New South Wales. So just going to delve a little bit more into interconnector flows over the quarter. And overall this quarter, we saw a significant southward shift in energy transfers due to the reduction in wind and hydro generation in the southern regions. So we start with the Queensland to New South Wales interconnector. There was an increase in southward flow, particularly outside of daylight hours. So can be seen here. During daylight hours, when we had the high solar generation and low or even negative prices in Queensland, Q&I often hit its transfer limits, so we couldn't transfer any more through to New South Wales. And in fact, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m, Q&I was at its import limit into New South Wales for 52% of dispatch intervals, which was up from 44% in Q2 2023. On the Victorian to New South Wales interconnector, average flows were still northwards towards New South Wales, but they decreased significantly to 68 megawatts from 455 megawatts last year. In the mornings, there was some southward flow into Victoria, and this was driven by sort of increased demand and higher prices in Victoria, which had some particularly cold mornings over the quarter. And overall, the VNI limit into Victoria bound for 23% of intervals this quarter, which was a lot higher than the 7% in Q2 2023. And then flows on Basslink also shifted strongly southwards, reversing from 59 megawatts last year northwards to 144 megawatts southwards this quarter. And in fact, Tasmania had its highest energy imports for Q2 since 2009. Finally, the flows from Victoria to Adelaide remained pretty similar to last year, this quarter last year, averaging 94 megawatts. Okay, so looking at the FCAS outcomes. So total FCAS costs reached 45 million, which was a $6 million increase from a year ago and a $16 million increase from Q1 2024. However, all regions apart from Queensland experienced reductions in their FCAS costs, and Queensland accounted for nearly 2/3 of the total costs this quarter at $30 million. So this was mainly driven by the contingency lower 6-second service, and this service had some quite high prices on the 7th and 8th of May when we needed to have local FCAS requirements in Queensland during the Armidale to Tamworth line outage. So overall, the lower 6-second costs made up 54% of the total FCAS costs, and the very fast raise 1 second contributed 15% to the total costs. And batteries also continued to increase their FCAS volume share, reaching 52% this quarter. And this growth in battery FCAS share is driven by both the new very fast markets and the entry of new batteries into the market. Actually, I was going to pause for Q&A here.
Thank you very much, Kerry. We have a few questions here. There's one that is quite interesting, but I will leave it later. So let's start with the battery. Something that also struck me, and Neil Marshman is asking if the batteries are setting prices. I guess this is related to your slide 6 at around 300. I think that was the higher end of of the batteries. So 245 there in the case of this particular year. The question from him is: does this mean that batteries are high cost components to the grid, and therefore with more batteries the prices will be lower?
Sorry, with more batteries. Well, I guess it's a matter of competition, isn't it? When you have more batteries, there will be more competition. Yes, correct.
So the expectation
but at the moment,
is,
at the moment, they are definitely setting price at the higher, higher than the gas generation. But yes.
All right. There's another question from Leon Fitzpatrick. This is related to the Basslink. Given that the Basslink is exporting electricity from Victoria to Tassie, can you please explain the role of the Marinus link into the future, given that the role is largely to support electricity export from Tassie to Victoria?
Okay.
So we'll. Okay, you got
yeah,
the question.
I mean, I would suggest you read the integrated system plan for the full details. But I mean, my understanding is that Marinus is planned for the future, and there's also will be planned changes in the actual renewable generation, including additional hydro storage in Tasmania, additional renewable generation in Tasmania and Victoria. So it's my understanding that the plan would be that Marinus link would flow both ways, but supported by that additional generation over time, including storage.
And for this is another question, but related as well to the transfer from Victoria to Tasmania. Why there's an increase this particular year in terms of the export from Victoria to Tasmania?
Yeah, I will look at the hydro generation as we come up, but it really is just that Tasmania had quite a low amount of rainfall, so the storage levels were reasonably low, so therefore less hydro generation due to the wanting to preserve water levels, and then Tasmania needing more support from the mainland.
Right. There's a question now related to the FCAS. Is the 1 second service still limited by a small number of batteries and the distributed resources, and hence it is likely to grow compared to the slower FCAS services?
So was that specifically for the raise 1 second or both? Sorry.
It doesn't say specifically for the raise, but let's take it for the raise 1 second.
So,
let's take it with that. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, at the moment, the batteries, I can't think off the top of my head, but it's the batteries are providing around 70% of the total, the very fast services. And then we've got the virtual power plants as well as demand response. And I think there was even a tiny bit of coal enablement, the FCAS, the very fast, but it is dominated by batteries. There are more batteries entering that FCAS market each quarter, but at the moment it's still in a transition. So there are still caps put on the requirements for those, the raise and the lower service. The raise at the moment, the actual enablement or the requirement is very close to the cap. So it is a tighter market, and that's why the prices for that service have stayed up. Whereas the lower service, its actual enablement is much lower than the cap, and its prices have been very low. But that, as I said, it is a transitional, those markets are still transitioning to full uncapped operation, and we are seeing quite a few batteries enter the market. So we would expect those dynamics to change over time.
Thanks for that, Kerry. There's one more question on technical side. There's one question I would leave for the very end that is still interesting. But Jeremy Harris is asking, as rooftop solar increases, will continue for the foreseeable time, how does AEMO calculate the contribution to the NEM from rooftop solar? Is it directly measured or back calculated? How it is done these days?
It's an estimate based off sensors and forecasting things. So it's not a full measurement, but it is measured. Like there are a lot of, I guess, sensors and measurement points, but it is scaled off that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a mix of things, and actually, there's a little bit more information on the AEMO website, actually, as a matter of fact. But yes, it's a mix of sources. Now, I appreciate the questions. Please continue writing the questions there on the Q&A. But just for the sake of timeliness, we will continue with the presentation from Kerry. Kerry, back to you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, let me just find where I was. There we go. Okay, so generation. So yeah, I'll just be starting with the overall generation changes. So this chart on the top right here shows the year-on-year changes in quarterly average generation by fuel type. And then we have those same changes but shown on a time of day profile underneath, so you can see how they change over the day. So in total, the NEM quarterly average generation was up 2%. Really, that was driven by that increase in underlying demand. We had calm conditions over the quarter, which led to a 20% reduction in wind generation. And then we had low rainfall conditions contributing to an 18% reduction in hydro generation. So with that, all other fuel types therefore increased generation in order to meet demand, with the largest increases in black coal and gas generation. The table here shows the supply mix contribution by fuel type. And we can see, all other fuel types apart from the wind and hydro increase their supply mix contribution, with black coal having the largest increase, reaching almost 45% of the total supply mix. So these changes in overall supply mix led to NEM total emissions increasing on Q2 2023 levels. And this is actually the first time we've had an increase in NEM emissions since 2015. So it really was kind of a more extreme quarter. Okay, I'll start looking at the individual fuel types, starting with the coal and gas. So coal generation increased year on year across the board. So this included the black coal in Queensland and New South Wales, shown here on the top, and then brown coal in Victoria underneath. So in Queensland, this generation increase was mainly driven by higher availability, with Callide Unit 3 and some other units back this quarter, with the resultant sort of impact on the volume offers, which I discussed earlier. However, in New South Wales, the increase in generation was actually despite a small decrease in availability. And in Victoria, there was only a really marginal increase in availability. So the uplifts in generation in these regions was really driven by that reduction in wind and hydro generation. Now, gas generation increased year on year on this chart shown on the bottom here, 16%. So while NEM-wide gas generation was up, that's 16% on quarter 2, 2023. It was around 23% lower than quarter 2, 2023, and in line with the quarter 2s prior to that. So, you know, it did seem like a large step up. It was also a factor of quarter 2, 2023 being lower. Tasmania, on the other hand, was quite notable in having increased gas generation, averaging 85 megawatts over the quarter, which is the highest level we'd had since quarter 2, 2019. And that was really due to the relatively low hydro generation in that region. So speaking of hydro generation, this was the lowest Q2 average level we've seen since 2017, as we show on this chart on the right. And it was lower in both Tasmania and New South Wales. So in Tasmania, it was 21% lower, and in New South Wales, it was 39% lower. And this was because the energy and storage in the main storage systems in Tasmania and in New South Wales were at lower levels at the end of the quarter than they were in the year before. So we saw that the hydro generators responded commercially to these lower storage levels by reducing the lower price volume they offered to the market. And if we look at the bid curve here for the NEM hydro generators, we can see that the bid curve shifted to the left. So there was around 700 megawatt less volume offered at prices below $300 per megawatt hour. On the other hand, in Queensland and Victoria, we did have some small increases in hydro generation, shown here, 19 megawatts on average and 31 megawatts on average in Queensland and Victoria. Okay, so looking at the changes in the grid scale variable renewable energy, the chart on the top right shows these changes on a regional basis, with the large reductions in wind generation visible in Victoria and SA and Tasmania. So wind did decrease across all regions apart from Queensland, with the largest drop in Victoria, where it was down 31%. Solar generation, on the other hand, did increase. We show on this chart at the bottom right where that growth in solar output arose from. So we did have around 51 megawatts on average extra availability from new capacity. And I'll just note, we define new capacity as facilities that connected since quarter 2, 2023. So not necessarily new this quarter, but new in the prior year. And also an increase in commissioning, which again is those facilities that have demonstrated ramping over the past year. There was also some small increases in existing capacity, and this is driven by an increase in grid scale of availability, which we show here in what we call these availability capacity factors. So I would say in the QED, we do use these availability capacity factors. So it's availability divided by the installed capacity. And this is to get a measure of the underlying resource level, excluding any offloading due to bids and pricing, which you would get in a more standard generation capacity factor. And from these, we can see that the grid scale availability did increase marginally across the NEM in all regions apart from Queensland. Okay, I will go into more wind because it was quite a big factor this quarter, where we had the lowest wind availability since quarter 2, 2017, and the lowest output since quarter 2, 2021. And these outcomes were driven by weather conditions. So over the quarter, we had a series of what they call blocking high pressure systems sitting over southern Australia for like extended periods of time, which caused low surface wind speeds. And the figure here on the top right gives an indication of the year-on-year changes in average monthly wind speeds, showing the reductions in Victoria, SA and Tasmania, and a lesser extent in New South Wales. So if we look at the changes in wind over the quarter in the various categories, we did actually have an increase in new capacity in commissioning, which added 167 megawatts to availability. And that would normally be relatively significant. However, it was well and truly dwarfed by this 900 megawatts reduction in existing wind output. So we've had a look here on the left. how the Q2 2024 wind resource compared with the longer term average and also the previous wind drought period of Q2 2017. So if we leave aside Queensland for a minute, we can see that quarters 1 and Q2 generally have the lowest sort of quarters for wind availability, which is the Q2 is a sort of solid bar. And then if we look at the dash, which is this quarter, Q2 2024, we can see that it was quite a bit lower than that average. It was actually 6 percentage points lower. However, it was still around 3 percentage points higher than the wind drought year of Q2 2017. However, though, of course, since we've had a lot of new wind capacity installed since 2017, the lower wind speeds this quarter were a lot more impactful as far as generation goes. Queensland does have a slightly different dynamic, with Q2 and 3 being the highest sort of wind resource on average and Q1 the lowest. But Queensland wind was actually still below the longer term Q2 average, but to a lesser extent at around sort of 4 percentage points lower. Other than that, we did manage to have this quarter a new record high half-hour wind generation record set on the 30th of May at 8,375 megawatts. It was quite interesting. It occurred right at the end of a week that had possibly the lowest wind in that week, but it got quite windy on that day. Okay, I'll look at the battery storage revenue. So the total estimated net revenue for the NEM grid scale batteries as a total was 41.2 million. And this is shown on the chart here on the right. So the main trends we see here are increases in the energy arbitrage, with energy revenue and including in that any revenue from charging at negative prices increasing up 22.6 million, which more than offset the increase in energy costs, which was up 10 million. Now, the FCAS revenue from batteries remained relatively flat, so that the total revenue share from FCAS markets reduced from 54% to 39%. And that's a continuation of a trend we've been seeing over previous quarters. And this increase in battery revenue is really being driven by the growth in battery generation availability, which we can see here has almost doubled since Q2 2023. Okay. I'm now going to move across to the gas market dynamics. So finished up with the NEM. Look here. So starting with the East Coast gas prices and demand, the East Coast wholesale gas price averaged $13.66 per gigajoule this quarter, spiking to above $15 per gigajoule at the end of June. So this was lower than Q2 2023 average of 14.21 gigajoule. And the difference is likely due to weather patterns. So whilst we did have cold weather in this quarter in the southern states, in the quarter before it was really quite cold in May. It sort of onset in May, whereas for us it got really cold in June. So it seems to be one of the main reasons. Now the ACCC netback forward prices also trended upward in line with domestic prices. However, the underlying reasons were somewhat independent to our domestic factors. So domestic factors included things such as the Longford outages, higher demand from gas-powered generators, increased reliance on iron storage withdrawals, and the need to maximise gas supply from northern states to the southern states. Whereas international factors included such things as interruptions to LNG production from Gorgon and Wheatstone, heat waves in the subcontinent forcing Indian buyers to procure spot LNG cargoes, and Chinese buyers also continued to be active in the spot LNG market. If we look at the right chart at the gas demand, it did increase slightly by 1% from Q2 2023. This was really driven by higher demand for gas-powered generation, which was up 5 petajoules, which is approximately an 18% year-on-year increase. The market demand, so AEMO market demand, was down 3 petajoules, approximately 4% lower. And this was despite overall colder weather year on year, particularly in Victoria and South Australia. And we did have an increase in LNG exports. So these totaled 341 petajoules, which was 2 petajoules higher than Q2 2023. So this LNG demand was actually the highest Q2 LNG demand on record. However, we do note that Gladstone LNG was actually lower than Q1 2024. And it is expected that GLNG's production will be higher from the start of Q4 this year. Okay, looking at the Victorian gas exports, these continue to decline, hitting the lowest Q2 record since the Gas Bulletin Board began reporting data in 2008. And this decrease is largely driven to the continued reduction in Longford production. However, this was slightly offset with Beach Energy's Otway field able to increase production from its Enterprise field, where it was able to produce up to 195 TJs during days of peak demand in the south. So with minimal gas being exported from Victoria to New South Wales, much of New South Wales demand was sourced by gas imports from Queensland and Moomba. And this shift is clearly illustrated on this chart on the right, which shows a record Q2 high for southerly flows on the South West Queensland pipeline. And we did note that at the end of June, the South West Queensland pipeline was scheduled to operate at maximum capacity for 5 days. And this has occurred after the South West Queensland pipeline capacity has increased 25% over the last 2 years. Okay, so looking at the gas production and capacity, focusing on Longford. So our production data, which I noted is also sourced from the Gas Bulletin Board, shows that this was the lowest Q2 production for Longford since data reporting began in 2008, totaling just 48.8 petajoules. And Longford's capacity for Q2 2024 was just 50.9 petajoules. And this continues to reflect the declining gas reserves in the Bass Strait field connected to Longford, and was one of the many reasons that led AEMO to publish the East Coast Gas System Risk or Threat Notice, which continues to be active until the 30th September, with AEMO continuing to monitor Victorian production facilities as well as the Iona underground storage quantities. And on this chart on the right, we can see that Longford daily production was almost at maximum capacity from May onwards this quarter. Longford did experience some issues with their production facility as they provided to AEMO in short-term capacity outlook reports. And I think we've probably been repeating this, but we will note that Longford and the Bass Strait fields have been supplying gas to Victoria since 1969, and it's been known since that time that gas fields would be likely to be running out in the 2020s. And, you know, what we're seeing now is really a reflection of that. Yeah, so I'll actually finish there for more questions, if I can.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kerry. And indeed, there are questions. Cool. So I will start with some of the technical questions. There's one question here related to gas. Most of the questions relate to the first part of the NEM. So let's start with the Queensland New South Wales interconnector. So one question is related to that and the fact that it was hitting in this quarter the limits for flows, where there's any plan to augment the capacity of this interconnector, or even if there's any value in doing so.
Okay. Wow. I just need to think for a tick. So just picturing the ISP in my head. I don't think there's a current committed project to increase the Q&I capacity on this one. Whether there's a future project as an actionable or sort of future project in the ISP, I don't know that there are in the shorter term. But one thing to note though, I will just say these can be a little bit tricky because whilst this is the flows on Q&I and the limits on Q&I, sometimes these limits can actually be set by a transmission element further down in the network. It's the way the constraint equations work. So just because there isn't necessarily a project called, Q&I upgrade in the integrated system plan as a committed one, doesn't mean that, say, Powerlink, the network service provider up in Queensland, don't have some projects in place that may, relieve some of the different constraints. And this quarter would have been impacted by that Armidale to town, or was, not would have been, was impacted by that Armidale to Tamworth line outage as well.
Thanks for that, Kerry. Kind of following with the Queensland theme here, why did Queensland contribute by a significant amount to the FCAS costs? I don't know which slide would that be, because I
think that's the next one. Yeah, that's because when we had that Armidale to Tamworth line outage, it meant that if we lost at the other line, Queensland would have been separated from the NEM. So in that case, we need to have a constraint in place to locally source FCAS requirements from Queensland. We can't get them from the entire NEM. So you're sort of cutting back your the amount of supply you can get. So supply and demand, often the prices will go up in that case. So we often do see when we've got local requirements in place, the FCAS prices do go up.
Thank you. There's a little bit provocative question. If in this quarter we didn't have gas, available to back up the challenges of renewables, particularly the reduced renewable supply, what would have done? What would have been the option if we didn't have gas?
If we didn't have gas. Look, I mean, I don't know that the coal generators weren't necessarily running. Sorry, I'm just moving around randomly here. Let me just remember where I'm up to. So there was some unused capacity at the coal generators that could have maybe come in. Whilst hydro generation was lower because of those storage levels, it wasn't that they couldn't operate at higher prices. They're making a commercial decision to try and preserve levels for when prices are higher. So it wasn't that we could have run more hydro, quite likely at higher prices, but yeah, that's probably what would have happened.
Yep. Thanks for that. There's a question now related, again, with renewables, but with wind particularly, and this is about the likelihood of the production. Is there any data to comment on that probability of wind production over the period and the likelihood of the actual outcome occurring? So is there any data that is available? I guess that's the question.
On the likelihood, look, these longer term wind farm capacity factors, we're looking at the data from that we have wind farms in the NEM. So it's about 2011 to 2024. So probably not enough to do that kind of statistical analysis on probability. Our forecasting teams, do look at actual wind speeds, so not limiting it to just the actual output wind farm. So probably would be better placed on that kind of probability question than I am.
Fair enough. And there's kind of a follow-up on that, but it's a different question. But it's related to wind and the wind conditions being relatively low. According to this Q2 here, it seems that 20% of the VW, that is volume-weighted wind availability, is actually being masked to a week with some other values where this value can go actually down to 10%. That's what I'm trying to interpret from the question. I guess that the bigger thing is what are the lessons for AEMO? That's a question. Planning as these events will drive the longer term needs for overall firming and longer duration energy storage. So given that this is happening, these sudden changes in the expected wind and sometimes can be quite low, is this prompting AEMO to think of more firm generation, I guess?
Yeah. So in the integrated system plan that AEMO produces, they do currently use wind traces or like wind output traces from when we've got them effectively. So they do currently in their plan for a year like the Q2 2017, so which was actually more extreme than this one, as well as kind of an artificial wind drought, which is even more extreme. So the ISP already does plan for these wind droughts, and that's part of the reason why it does have a large amount of storage requirements as well as the backup gas in its forecast for the optimal generation going forward.
Thanks for that. There was more a comment than question that apparently that the Q&A was declared actionable in the ISP. Thanks for sharing to the person that was sharing that. There's
Thank
now
you.
a question related to gas demand. There's a 4% CIR. I missed the CIR. what it stands for, East Coast fall in the gas demand, right? Is there a breakdown for CNR and a breakdown by state as well? Because apparently that information is there, especially in South Australia and Victoria, as far as the information was there. But is there a breakdown there?
In the breakdown of the gas demand in
Yes,
CNI and residential?
Yes.
I don't have it here.
Sure.
I'm afraid. I'm trying to picture if it's in the QED or not. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure at least most of the residential would be from South Australia and Victoria, but yeah, I don't off the top of my head have a breakdown of that gas demand, I'm afraid. I know it is something that we are keen on looking at a bit more in the next QED, particularly as it was down in this first kind of month of winter whilst it was quite cold. So in the next QED, we will have an entire winter. So we do want to look at that a bit more closely. But I still don't know if we will have that breakdown of the regions. I think we tend to report overall. So sorry about that.
Look, thanks for that, Kerry. And we have here a final question. It is not necessarily a technical, but I believe that there's important. That's why I'm bringing it up. So Glenn is sharing with us that apparently, every time that AEMO give this quarterly report, sometimes apparently there's a flurry of social media, that mistakenly talks about it, and sometimes, implying that the NEM spot prices are the wholesale prices that the retailers pay, but actually, in reality, that's not how it works. So the question really is AEMO planning to do anything or can do anything to help to avoid this confusion?
Yeah, I mean, we notice as a general thing that every document we put out tends to be picked up in new and interesting ways in social media, and often picked up from some people to say one thing and opposite. But on that question around the separation of what we're reporting, which is the outcomes from the NEM and the East Coast gas wholesale markets versus the costs that the retailers, actually pay, or the the sort of default market offers and so forth. I'll have to take that on notice about whether that's something that we can look at in our messaging at all. So, okay.
Thank you for that, Kerry. And since there are no further questions, and some of the questions actually were addressing some points I was going to raise, I think that this is a good time to finish this presentation. Kerry, thank you very much for the insights being provided today. Very professional slides, as usual, coming from AEMO, and this is a very interesting report. All the slides are going to be available to the attendees. And to the attendees, thank you very much for joining us. We're more than 100 people actually joining online, and of course, people will see the recording as well at some point when available. Kerry, again, thank you very much, and everyone have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nando. Thank you, everyone.